Amongst the things of which Hoshana Raba is unique and different to the other days of Sukkot is number one, in the Beis HaMikdash, every day of Sukkot, they would go around the Mizbeach one time, they would circle the Mizbeach one time, and Hoshana Raba, they would do this 7 times. Another difference, every day of Sukkot, they would set up a branch of the Arava. There would be lots of branches, they would set up these branches of the Arava, each person would set up a branch next to the Mizbeach. But this was only done if that particular day of Sukkot was during the week. If it was, however, on Shabbos, so most days, if they fell out on Shabbos, they wouldn't set up these aravis against the Mizbeach. But if the 7th day of Sukkot, Hoshana Raba, fell out on Shabbos, then they would do it even on Shabbos. And the reason why it's being done even on Shabbos is to publicize that this idea of setting up the Arava branch is considered a mitzvah. Now, all of that is in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Nowadays, we also do something on Hoshana Raba with an Arava. We call it, we refer to it as a Hoshanas, but it's technically an Arava. So we're going to be calling it an Arava throughout this whole Sicha. So these Aravos, we don't take all the rest of the days of Sukkot as a Zeicher to the Beis HaMikdash. We only do this on the 7th day. That's what we take nowadays. So in other words, the other days of Sukkot, there is no concept of this extra Arava Hoshanas that we do at all. Another thing, says the Rebbe, in which Hoshana Raba is unique specifically after the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash. The way the calendar is set up, it was made that Hoshana Raba shouldn't fall out on Shabbos. That is, in the times when based and established the months, based on the sighting of the moon, etc., if they saw that Hoshana Raba, the day of Arava as it's called over here, is going to fall out on Shabbos, so then they would add an extra day to one of the months. In other words, having instead of a month of 29 days, they would make sure it's a month of 30 days. In order that Hoshana Raba should be pushed off by a day, it should fall out on Sunday rather than on Shabbos. And so that they should never miss out on this opportunity of taking the Arava on this day of Hoshana Raba. As it says in Yerushalmi, Reb Simoin would give an order to those that calculated and figured out how the month should work. He would tell them, make sure that Tkiyas Shofar shouldn't have to fall out on Shabbos. In other words, Rosh Hashanah shouldn't fall out on Shabbos. Make sure that an Arava, meaning Hoshana Raba, shouldn't fall out on Shabbos. And if you're pressured, you don't have any choice, then rather ensure that Hoshana Raba doesn't fall out on Shabbos as opposed to Rosh Hashanah. In other words, Rosh Hashanah could fall out on Shabbos, but make sure Hoshana Raba doesn't fall out on Shabbos. Later on, when there was no longer the establishing the months based on the sighting of the moon and based on the sighting, instead there was a calendar worked out based on calculations. So here we have, again, it was set up in a way that Hoshana Raba will never fall out on Shabbos. In fact, according to some Rishonim, the reason why we have a rule that Lo Yadu Rosh, that Rosh Hashanah shouldn't fall out on Sunday, Wednesday or Friday. So one of the reasons given for this by Rishonim is because if Rosh Hashanah will fall out on a Sunday, then automatically Hoshana Raba will end up on Shabbos. Now here is the interesting thing. Hoshana Raba, we're making sure it doesn't fall out on Shabbos, even though regarding Shofar and Lulav, we're actually not concerned. In other words, now in our calendars, Rosh Hashanah definitely could fall out on Shabbos. And the first day of Sukkot, the mitzvah of Lulav, could also end up being on Shabbos, and we won't do those mitzvahs, even though these mitzvahs are a do'iraisa to do them on the first day of Sukkot and our Rosh Hashanah. So Tosfos asks the question, how can we possibly say this? That the day of Arava, in other words, Hoshana Raba, well, which we're doing only as a zeicher for the Beis HaMikdash, here we're concerned that Hoshana Raba shouldn't fall out on Shabbos to ensure we always take this extra Arava on this day. And these mitzvahs d'oraisa we're not concerned about. Tosfos answered that really that's exactly the point. Those mitzvahs that are midoiraisa, and they say clearly in psukim, we're never worried that people are not going to act properly with them. We're never worried that people are going to act in some disparaging way to them in other years. In other words, if they missed 1 year because it was Shabbos, there's nothing to be concerned about in future years that they're not going to treat it properly. But the Arava, which is the Rabbanan, in other words, this is only, as we said, we're doing it Zeichel and Mikdash, We're concerned that people are not going to treat it with the proper respect. Eventually, if 1 year they didn't take on a Shabbos, they'll think it doesn't matter so much. Or to quote the Prisha, that because of the concern that Yidden shouldn't forget about this mitzvah, in other words, will be taken lightly, so that's why the Chachamim made this extra chizuk, this extra strengthening, even more than they did for something Minat Torah, to make sure that this is always done in the proper way. The Rebbe says, we know that all matters of Torah are very, very precise. So it's understood that the actual fact that because of this mitzvah of Arava, an extra day is going to be added to a previous month, just to make sure that the mitzvah of Arava could be done. It's understood that this mitzvah must have something very, very special and unique in which it's different to all other mitzvahs. In other words, it's not just a technical thing. There must be something deeper over here why we specifically want to make sure that we're always doing the mitzvah of Arava. Or again, in our language, would be the mitzvah of Hoshana. To explain this, says the Rebbe, we're first going to have a look at the general geder of this mitzvah of Arava, which was a separate mitzvah in the Beis HaMikdash. As we said, they would set it up against the Mizbeach. This is other than, separate to, the mitzvah of Arava in the Lulav. And what was the mitzvah? How did it actually work? The Rebbe is now quoting the Rambam. How did this mitzvah work? So every single day of the 7 days of Sukkot, they would bring these branches of Arava and set it up on the side of the Mizbeach. The tops of the Aravas bending over on top of the Mizbeach. And when they would set it up, when they would bring it and set it up, they would blow, they would take Tkiya and Tru and Tkiya. Says the Rebbe, the fact that this Arava has a separate obligation, a separate mitzvah for itself, this itself can be learned in two different ways. One way is that it's only that we're doing a different act with technically the same Aravos. In other words, the gather of the Arava, the general principle of the Arava, or the object that we're using, is basically the same thing that we're using in the Lulav, but we're doing something different with it. We're doing a different mitzvah with it that we're doing specifically with this Arava that we're going to set up by the Mizbeach. So that's one way of looking at it, that they're technically both the same idea, it's just two different things we do with them. Another way of looking at it is that it's not only another action as far as how the person is doing, what the person is doing with it in the Beis HaMikdash, but in a certain sense it almost becomes like a different chefetz, it's a different object. The Arava takes on a different status. What's a practical difference, lahalacha? According to the first way, if technically they're both the same, the status of each one is basically the same, we're just doing different actions with it. So then what should follow is that the shiur of the Arava in the Beis HaMikdash, the minimum size of it, should technically be the same size as the Arava in the Lulav. Because it's basically the same Arava by both mitzvahs, we're just doing two different things with it. But according to the second way, that the chidush of the Arava in the Beis HaMikdash is that it's a totally different concept, it's a totally different idea. So then there might be a difference also in the shiur, in the minimum measurement of the Arava. In fact, says the Rebbe, based on this, we could say that that's what the Machloikas and the Gemara is about regarding the shiur of the Arava in the Beis HaMikdash. So there is one opinion that says that it actually needed to be 3 branches with moist leaves. So this is similar to the Arava in the Lulav. In the Arava and Lulav, we have 2 branches. We're here for various reasons. We're taking 3 branches, as the Rebbe explains in the footnote. But basically, it also has to be a few branches and they have to have several leaves on them. Or even 1 leaf on 1 branch is enough. So again, this is going to have to do with what we just said before. Is it technically the same Aravos, or is it a totally different type of, the status of the Arava is a very different one. Furthermore, says the Rebbe, let's have a look at the Rambam. The Rambam paskins, halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that we bring in the Beis HaMikdash another Arava besides the Arava of the Lulav. And the Rambam says we're not yoitze with the Arava of the Lulav. And the shear, the measurement of it is even 1 leaf on 1 branch. Says the Rebbe, we look carefully at the words of the Rambam, where he says Arava Acheres, a different Arava than the Arava of the Lulav, and you're not yoitze with the one of the Lulav. That seems to be implying that not only is it a different action that we're going to do with it, but it's sort of like a different Arava. It's different in essence, it's different. And therefore you're not yoitza with the arava of the lulav, which the simple reading of the language seems to be implying that you wouldn't be yoitza if you took even if you took the arava by itself, not together with the lulav, but you took that arava, you wouldn't be yoitza. And furthermore, as we said, the shiur is going to be even one leaf on one branch. Says the Rebbe, based on this, according to the Rambam, we could say that this is the machloikas between Abba Shaul and the Rabbanon, which the Gemara quotes. Abba Shaul learns the idea of where do we know this concept that there's this extra mitzvah of arava that needed to be put in the Beis HaMikdash. From the same pasuk that we learn about the aravis of the lulav. The pasuk says in the Daled Minim that we need to take arvei nochal. Now the word arvei is in plural, implying two different mitzvahs we're going to do with these aravis. One for the lulav and one taken specially in the Beis HaMikdash. On the other hand, the Chachamim, the Rabbanan hold, no, it's just a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. As the Gemara discusses over there, another few things that are also halacha l'Moshe Misinai. There's one halacha regarding saplings in the time just preceding Shemitah, whether you're allowed to work in the field. If there's 10 saplings, there's the halachas of Nisuch HaMayim, the water that was poured on the Mizbeach on Sukkot. These are halacha l'Moshe Misinai, which don't have any support in the Psukim. And therefore, says the Rebbe, according to Abba Shaul, since the mitzvah of Arava is being commanded and being learned from the pasuk of Arvei Nochal, which says about the Arava of the Lulav, so then we would say that basically the object, the status of the Arava of the Mikdash is exactly the same one as the one in the Lulav. It's only that we're learning out from the plural that there's another mitzvah that we have to do with the Arava. But the Chachamim say, no. The Arava in the Beis HaMikdash is a totally separate thing. This is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. It has nothing to do with the Aravos that say by the lulav, the Arvei Nochal, and therefore this mitzvah of Arava has a totally different gather, a different status, a different chefetz, it's a different object, as said before. Says the Rebbe, to explain al pi pnimi yisonyanim, this idea of this mitzvah of the Arava, the separate Arava that was taken in the Beis HaMikdash, or again that we call Hoshanas, is different and unique, different to the Arava of the Lulav. So to explain this, says the Rebbe, we know that regarding the idea of an Arava, the Frierdiker Rebbe says, Arava represents the simple Yidden, that their mitzvahs are being done just with emunah pshuta, with pure and simple faith. Says the Rebbe, in those words of the Frierdiker Rebbe, this actually is giving us a whole new and deeper insight into the famous Medrash. The Medrash tells us that the 4 species that we take correspond to 4 different kinds of Yidden. We know that the esrog that has both a taste and a smell refers to the Yidden that have Torah and Maisim Tovim. We have the Kapos Tmorim, the Lulav, that has a taste but doesn't have a smell, represents those Yidden that have Torah but not Maisim Tovim. The Hadas that has a smell and not a taste represents the Yidden that have Maisim Tovim but don't have Torah. And finally, the Arava that doesn't have neither a taste or a smell refers to those Yidden that don't have Torah and Maisim Tovim. Now, when we read those words of the Medrash on the surface level, it seems to be that Esrig is the one, the Yid, that has both Torah and Maisim Tovim, whereas in all the other 3, they are missing something, either Torah or mitzvahs, or perhaps even missing both. That's the way we would understand the Medrash without the words of the Frierdiker Rebbe. But what does the Frierdiker Rebbe say? We just said, the Frierdiker Rebbe says it's those Yidden that are doing mitzvahs with emunah pshuta. That means the Arav is the Yidden that are doing mitzvahs in the emunah pshuta. In other words, they're doing mitzvahs. The Rebbe quotes more from the Frierdiker Rebbe there. The Frierdiker Rebbe says all Yidden are equal in the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs, which tells us that all 4 categories do have both things. They are for learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. They learn Torah, they know Torah, they fulfill the mitzvahs. And the Rebbe says this could also be understood, and it's obvious, even if we just look at the idea of what the Medrash is telling us. If we say that a lulav is the person that's learning Torah properly, so obviously he's fulfilling mitzvahs. Because the whole point of learning is limud mevili demaisa. Learning brings to actions. Similarly, a person that's doing the good deeds, the mitzvahs, obviously has the knowledge of Torah in order to be able to know how to fulfill the mitzvahs. And from this we can also apply the same idea to the Raba as well, that obviously these Yidden are also fulfilling Torah and mitzvahs practically. Rather, says the Rebbe, the inner meaning of the words of the Medrash is that the difference mainly is in the way or the quality of how they're learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. That is, generally Torah is connected with the Maila, the virtue of Seichel, the quality of Seichel, of intellect. Maisim Tovim is more connected with that quality and virtue of Midos, of our feelings. And this would be the difference now in what the Medrash is telling us about these four different categories. Of course they're all learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. But Esrog represents the Yid that are learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, both with the quality of intellect as well as the Maila and the quality of Midos. The Lulav are those Yidden that are again learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, but what they mainly excel is in the Maila of Seichel of their intellect. The Hadas is the ones that are excelling specifically in the area of Midos. And Rava is referring to those simple Jews that of course they're learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, but they're lacking both the quality of Seichel and the quality of Midas, and therefore, as quoted before from the Friedrich Rebbe, their fulfillment of it is just purely with Emunah Pshuta, with simple faith. Says the Rebbe, based on this, we also understand that in truth, this category of Arava has a certain milo, a certain advantage over the other three types. As it's known, the famous Vart of the Baal Shem Tov, that the Pshitus, the simplicity of the Anoshim Pshutim of these simple, sincere Yidden, is one with Pshitus Oatzmus, with that pure essence of Hashem himself in that purest state. Says the Rebbe, this special quality of the Arava, which is specifically expressed in the fact of Pshitus and the simplicity, is mirrored, is reflected in the actual Arava itself. How so? So the Rebbe explains, it's known the reason why the mitzvah of Ulekachtam Lachem, why the Torah gave us this mitzvah specifically of these four species. Because in each one of them is emphasized and noticeable the characteristic of unity, of Achdus. The Lulav, all the leaves of the Lulav are all together, they're not spread out, they're all like held together tightly. So that's one element of Achdus. The Hadas, we know the three little leaves, each one has to come out of one stem. The Aravois in the Gemara are actually called Achvana. What does the word Achvana mean? They grow in Achva, in brotherhood, in brotherliness, in unity. They've grown these bunches all together. And finally, the Esroig, which lives on its tree from one year to the next year, is the idea that it unites all the different seasons, all the different types of weathers and seasons, etc. And furthermore, not only does it survive throughout all four seasons, it actually grows and thrives from all of the seasons together. So all of these four represent the idea of Achdus. Now the Rebbe says, the fact that there are certain things in the world that have this idea of Achdus, although seemingly the world itself is a concept of Yeshus. The nature of the world itself is all about very much feeling of self, feeling of ego, etc. And therefore, seemingly, it would be more natural for all things to have this feeling of ischalkos, of separation. Because that's what oilam is all about. In fact, the word oilam is from the word helim, it's concealing on the truth. And therefore, as a result of this feeling of selfishness, ego, there's more this feeling of separation. So the idea that there can be some things that do have this idea, this element of Achdus, is coming because inside of them is shining the Pshitus, that purity, again, that pure essence, the Achdus, Apshuta of Hashem, that oneness of Hashem. And it is the Pshitus, this pure, non-divisible essence of Hashem that's shining in them, that's what causes this oneness, this iskalalus, this inclusion of each one of these four species, that it's felt in them in a revealed way rather than their yeshus, than their feeling of self, which would come based on the nature of the world. Instead, what's being felt is also this idea of this bitul, humility, being humble, and therefore that brings out this feeling of achdus, of oneness, in a revealed way. But, says the Rebbe, even in this character, in this characteristic of oneness, of achdus within these four minim, we again see a difference in between the other three and the arava. So by the other three, the esrog, the lulav, and the hados, the achdus in each one of them is within itself. That is, by the lulav, it's the leaves of the same lulav that are all closely growing together and held together tightly. By the hados, it's within the branch itself, it's the three leaves coming from the same stem. And so to the esrog, we're speaking about one esrog that grows on the tree throughout all four seasons. But it's not about one lulav being connected with another lulav, or a hados with another hados, or an esrog, etc. Whereas by the arava, the achdus is the fact that the aravos are growing in brotherliness, in oneness with each other, in bunches together. Says the Rebbe, since the achdus by the arava is in a broader way, in a greater way than in the other types. And again, as we said before, this is the opposite of the nature of the world, because the nature of the world is more about separation, things being separate from each other. So it's understood that why is the unity, the one is being highlighted over here even more. It's clearly because the pshitus shalamayla, that pure oneness of Hashem, is shining in a more revealed way in the arava more than the other three things. In fact, says the Rebbe, this is also the reason why by the arava the achdus is even connected to its name. We said it's called achvana, as opposed to the other three. Says the Rebbe, we could say that the reason why this achdus is more begili by the arava, this idea that we just explained, this is connected with the very point that we were speaking about before of how the arava is as opposed to the other ones. That is, by the other categories, the lulav, the esrog, and the hados, since each one of them has its own special quality, or several qualities together, seichel and midos, as we said, the lulav has a taste, the hados has a smell, or the esrog has both. So these open and revealed qualities of seichel and midos are actually concealing, they're blocking out that pure innocence, if you want to call it, and that oneness, that purity that really exists inside of them. And therefore, also in some way, the achdus is not in the not in the highest way. Because we said before, the achdus is coming when the achdus, the pshitus shalamayla, the oneness of Hashem, the purity of Hashem is shining. To the extent that you could actually even think, in other words, we don't see that pshitus, we could actually think that perhaps they were chosen not because of the achdus. You might think it's because of their special qualities, the taste or the smell, etc. Whereas when we come to the arava, which doesn't have any open or revealed virtues, we said it doesn't have the taste, it doesn't have a smell. So here, the achdus, the oneness of it, that is standing in the most revealed way, in the most simplistic and obvious way. To the extent that other than the achdus, we can't even see any logical reason why the arava should be one of the daled minim. So that's again because the pshitus or atzmus is shining over here in the most revealed way in its nature and even in its name. The Rebbe says this is similar to what we see the difference by Yidden. That even though, of course, every single Yid is a Chelek alikami ma'amam, as a portion of Hashem, which is connected to the pshitus, to that oneness, to the purity of the essence of Hashem himself. But nevertheless, we see that by those Yidden that are, so to speak, rich in seichel or midos, then these open and revealed milas will often conceal on the emunah pshuta, on the simple, sincere faith that comes from the etzem haneshama. It is specifically by the simple Jews that don't have any open or revealed milas of seichel and midos, that by them that you see the emunah pshuta, which, as we said before, it's their pshutas, their simplicity that's one with that pshutas, with that purity of atzmos, with the essence of Hashem. Says the Rebbe, based on all of this, we can now understand the special, unique idea of the mitzvah arava shebemikdash over the arava of the lulav. Because we said before that there are two very different categories. The arava of the lulav, even though on its own we said it doesn't have any open and revealed milos, and therefore we recognize in it and we feel in it the inyan of achdus and the fact that they grow in brotherliness. Nevertheless, by the lulav, since now we are combining it with the other three species, to the extent they're now becoming one mitzvah, so therefore the pshitus, that simplicity in it, which as we said before is mainly seen when you don't see any other qualities. So therefore now that it's being put together with the other one, that's no longer in its purest state either anymore. In other words, when we put it together with these other types, so then the arava itself is in a certain sense absorbing or being part of these other milos. as opposed to the Arava of the Mikdash, which its mitzvah, its idea, is just a separate Arava that has no connection with anything else, with any other things of qualities. So therefore, it's in this mitzvah, which there's absolutely nothing concealing, no other qualities, no other virtues are concealing it, and therefore the pshitus of Atzmus is standing in a most revealed way. Says the Rebbe, we could say that this is the reason for the opinions that hold that when they would go around the Mizbeach on Hoshana Raba 7 times, so there's one of the opinions in the Gemara hold that what they went around with was only with the lulav and the other 3 types that come along with lulav, and not with the arava. They didn't walk around with that arava. That was a completely mitzvah for itself. As we said, we're going to set up those aravas on the side of the mizbeach, but one opinion says that they didn't even circle the mizbeach with it. And that's why the arava is taken by itself, and you're not yoytze, as we said before, with the arava of the lulav. And also we said the shear is not going to be the same shear as the arava of the lulav. In other words, it doesn't have to be necessarily those 3 moist branches, but rather it could even be 1 leaf on 1 branch, which is all emphasizing the idea that it's not an achdus that's put together from a number of details, but rather, again, achdus pshuta, just pure achdus. Says the Rebbe, according to all of this, we can understand why the Arava of the Mikdash is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and it's not something that's explicit in Torah Shemiksav, not even learnt out from a pasuk, at least again, as we said before, at least according to one of the opinions. And the Rebbe says this is similar to something that's explained in Likutei Torah regarding the difference of Nisuch HaMayim, the pouring of the water on the 7th day of Sukkot, which is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and Nisuch HaYayin, the pouring of the wine, which says clearly in Torah Shemiksav in a number of places. The Alter Rebbe explains is because Nisuch HaMayim, pouring of the water, is actually coming from a higher level than pouring the wine. And that's why it can't even come down into the written format, into the form of oisis, of letters in Torah Shemiksav, as the Alter Rebbe explains there at length. So says the Rebbe, in a similar way is this the mile of the Arava in the Beis HaMikdash over the Arava in the Lulav. That doesn't even come down as an explicit command in Torah Shemiksav, because again, it's coming from a level that's higher than being revealed in Torah in a way of being written in a specific form of letters, etc. In the soul of the person, what that means is it's connected to such a high level of the neshama that's connected, and one with Hashem, with pshit, the pshitus hanevesh, that purest part of the soul, which is one with Hashem, and therefore the Yid doesn't even have to be explicitly commanded about it in explicit words in Torah Shemiksav. Says that according to all of this, we can now also understand the Arava nowadays. Again, this is speaking about the Arava that we take on Hoshana Raba, which we take only on the 7th day. And Bizman Hazeh, it's not even the Halacha L'Moshe Messina that we're doing. It's only a Minig Nevi'im. And the Rebbe points out an interesting thing. The Rebbe says that there's some of the Rishonim that explain Minig Nevi'im over here means not even that the Nevi'im told the people to act this way, but it's a Minig that the Nevi'im themselves did, and people saw and copied and did the same thing. Says the Rebbe, that itself shows that B'Pnimius, the Arava that we take today is even higher than the Arava in the Beis HaMikdash, which is Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. And the Rebbe again makes this something similar to something that the Rebbe says in Likutei Torah, where he says that the hakafos that we do, Shmini Atzeres, are not even written down, not even in Torah Sheba'al Peh. In other words, it's not even considered a D'Rabbanan, it's only a minhag. The Alter Rebbe explains that they are even higher than something like Nisuch HaMayim, which is at least a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Because the idea of a minhag Yisrael, that Yidden are acting in a certain way, shows that this is because they are connected, this is connected to the shayrish of where the Neshamas Yisrael is coming from, where their Neshamas are rooted, which really proceeds even higher than Torah. In other words, because of this level of that purest, most inner level of the Yid, where he's one with the Pshitus of Atzmos, so he senses, he feels even those in Yonim that are higher than coming down into writing into any sort of form. In other words, how the Chachma of Hashem, the Ratzon of Hashem was already revealed in Torah and mitzvahs, or even in the Rabbanans, and rather the Yidden are able to act in this way even without being instructed or commanded directly in any way whatsoever. Says the Rebbe, and because Yidden act this way, because it's Minig Yisrael, it becomes a Minig Yisrael, so therefore, now it becomes Torah. As we say, Minig Yisrael becomes Torah, as explained elsewhere. Says the Rebbe, based on all of this, we can now understand the deeper idea of about Hoshana Raba, the day of Arava, and not falling out on Shabbos. Even though on the simple level and on the external level, the reason is we work out that Hoshana Raba shouldn't come out on Shabbos so that we don't miss out on a day on taking this Arava. And the simple reason for that is because the Arava is a lighter or a smaller obligation, and we're concerned that people are not going to take it seriously, and therefore they wanted to be mechazik their words even more than words of Torah. But the Rebbe says we could say that B'Pnimi is the reason is it's because the Arava is connected to a higher level. In other words, because in the Arava, which is a minig neviim, we said, is being expressed this idea of in the most purest way, this idea of pshitus ha'atzmos, therefore it always needs to be taken every single year. We're mekayim the mitzvah of Arava in an equal and a similar way without any difference whatsoever. And the Rebbe says this itself is a chizuk on its own. In other words, not that it needs an extra chizuk, as we said, but this itself is a chizuk. That it affects even the time of the world. That based in, organize the calendar in a way, the months in a way, that in a way that it could never absolutely affect this idea of taking the Arava on its proper day.